And we made it. Hi and welcome to Homo Ludens, the channel on history and board games. I'm super excited tonight. We're going to talk about my favorite kind of war games, card-driven games. We're going to talk about what they are, what makes them so special, and what is the future for that specific family of war games. So by the way, actually, if you subscribed recently, I made a video a while ago that was doing a statistical analysis of the CDG production over time. So I recommend that you check it out. And I will add a link in the description or a small card that you might see up there if you're watching this after the live. But back to today's stream, I thought it would be awesome to talk about this specific topic of card-driven games with three designers that are known for their brilliant and pretty influential CDG design. And I have the pleasure to have on the stream tonight, first of all, Volko. Hi, Volko.
Thank you
for coming. So for once, you're not a surprise guest, so that's really nice. For those who don't know, Volko is the creator of the Coin series, but before that, you actually designed two really good and very interesting CDGs, Wilderness War and Labyrinth. So super happy to have you here. And then the legendary Mark Herman. Hi, Mark. Thanks for coming.
Good to hear you.
And Mark is the designer of classics such as Washington's War, Empire of the Sun, and I think your most recent CDG was Fort Sumter, or we could say that some of the Statesman series are CDGs, but that's maybe a discussion for later. And my final guest for tonight is Jason Matthews, so author of GMT's best-selling game Twilight Struggle, and other very innovative CDGs like 1989, but also 1960, Making of a President. So hi, Jason. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for everyone, and I also want to say hi to everyone in the chat. I see that there is a lot of people that are already there, so hi to everyone. Just a quick note for people watching the stream. As usual, feel free to post your question in the live chat, and I would be happy to bring them on screen and ask your question to the guest. If you see that your question is not coming right away, that's probably because I will bring it up at a later point. Because I tried, and I will try to hold to that structure of interview in three different parts. The first one would be around history and definition. The second part would be around the current state of the genre. And then we'll talk about the future of the CDGs. We'll also have a short interlude, probably at the 1 hour mark or something like this. And this interlude will be for each of our guests to actually share with us their top 3 current CDGs, because I've heard that on YouTube those kind of things work pretty well. So we're trying to get some views. So we'll have a bit that interlude there. But I think that's it for the introduction. And maybe what I would like to start before we talk about the topic of today, it's something that I like to ask the guests when they come in on the show, is maybe just hear a bit about themselves and how they discovered war games. So what was their journey into wargaming and how it was the first contact with the hobby. And I would like to start with you, Mark.
Oh, sure. I started in the hobby a long time ago. I was, I guess it was like over 50 years ago, I guess. And I found well, first I started as a child, I played chess. So that was really my first strategy game. That was really the only game I played through most of my, the single digit youth years. And then around 12, I discovered Avalon Hill's Battle of the Bulge. And, I sort of really took a shine to it. And I spent pretty much the rest of my life playing those kind of games.
Cool. And you, Volko, how was it?
Early 1970s, I was in 5th grade visiting a friend's house, and he had a copy of Panzerblitz, and he didn't know, he had gotten it from somewhere. He didn't know what it was, and he wasn't very interested in it. But I just loved the way you could fit the boards together, and I was like, that's kind of cool. And I started looking them in stores. And my first game, which I bought shortly after that, was France 1940.
Oh, nice. And you, Jason, how did you get into the wargaming hobby?
Well, my dad, when I was, I believe, in 7th grade or something like that, he bought me the plastic version of Axis and Allies for Christmas. And that started off my introduction to the hobby. My dad and I played every weekend, 3 or 4 times a weekend. It became an obsession, and I started to look around for the next thing, and weirdly, Origins was in Los Angeles, which is where I grew up. And so I went to Origins looking for Axis and Allies, and then I sort of discovered the whole giant world.
Maybe as a quick follow-up to this, which was the first card-driven game that each of you played, starting with you, Jason?
We the People, for sure.
Yeah.
That really changed my whole perspective on wargaming.
And you, Volko?
I missed We the People, and I can explain why. But for me, it was Hannibal, Rome versus Carthage by Mark Simonich shortly after that, and after We the People came out, and it also completely changed my perspective on war games.
And Mark, I don't know if you can answer that question, because I guess you might have designed the first one, so you probably played your own prototype.
It was the People, obviously, but
Yes.
the other choice.
Another answer would have been super surprising, but I think that gives a very nice intro. So thanks for that. And I guess we can probably jump into that first part, and I think we can start straight into talking about the subject that makes people upset on Board Game Geek quite a bit. And let's talk about definition. And I would like to ask the question first: what is for you a CDG? How would you define it? What makes a CDG, and what makes a game just a card-assisted game or something like this? What would you say, Mark?
Well, first off, I want to say that We the People, when I did it, wasn't a card-driven game in my mind. I mean, I did a game about a counterinsurgency, and it was a area control game that happened. Ultimately, it was first an area control game about, you control Virginia. The idea was to control more colonies than the other side to win the war. So, and that was inspired by reading. I don't know if you've ever seen the TV show Turn. There's a character called Lieutenant Colonel John Simcoe, and I actually got to read his memoir that was privately published in England right after the war, and it just changed my whole understanding of the American Revolution. It was like whatever I knew about it, I just felt like I didn't know anything about it, and so I saw the war very differently, and that's what led me to an area control, game, where and that's really with the placing the PC marker. So that's what I started off with, and then I had these events, and then one day I just sort of said, like, why am I using this mechanism when I can just put it all together? So that's kind of really what ended up happening. And then the term CDG comes from pretty much Gene Billingsley doing marketing. It was a branding thing. So because it wasn't called a area control game, it was a card-driven game, and so cards became the focus. Certainly, when I did it, what I liked about it was, my father was a big gin rummy player. I mean, everybody I knew in Brooklyn played gin rummy. And so having played probably ridiculous number of gin rummy games, I always liked holding cards. I always liked the idea of holding you have a set of cards, and then I like hearts and spades and bridge. And so it was a natural thing to, when I had cards, I said, this is really kind of cool. I get to make choices. I had like this menu of choices that's random each time I do it. And so that was really the driver for the cards for me, was that, tactile decision-making element. And the thing that I would say is there were three, and when I say I created the beginning of the genre, but I want to say that there's like three people who really created the genre in my mind, the way it's currently defined. So let me just say, so I obviously did the initial hash up of the whole thing, and it kind of came out okay. Mark Simonich, when he did Hannibal, he was the one who said, I had this thing where I had separate events from cards, and that was an intentional choice at that time, but Mark felt better to put the two together. So most people,
events and operations,
they're going to lay out this, this choice between this or that, right? And that's not a choice in Washington's world, though. I will say that Charlie Vasey and I, once in a long conversation, decided that early, before there was staffs, we felt that you shouldn't have the choice, and that's why Unhappy King Charles, comes out very much like directly out of We the People. And then, of course, Ted Racer with Paths of Glory sort of to the cards, right? So the cards gain greater functionality to all that. And I don't want to say something, and this is a compliment to Volko, which I really try not to do too often, but I can't help myself. There is an enormous amount of complexity when you have 7 cards in your hand, and what are you going to do? And a lot of people get what they call analysis paralysis. And what Volko did when he kind of evolved from what I'll call the CDG to Labyrinth to the coin series is he took the hand of cards out of your hand, and you had 2 choices. And that lowers the complexity and the barrier to entry tremendously. I mean, it just takes a whole level of complexity. Now, I'm saying I happen to like that complexity, but for some people, that's the thing that was driving them crazy. So if you play a game of For the People, or We the People, or Empire of the Sun, or Twilight Struggle, or Wilderness War, and just go on and on, that hand of cards represents both kind of a cool thing, but it also means like, what the heck do I do next? For some people, that's almost like too stressful. That's what I would say.
And for you, Volko, would you have a build up on that, on how you would define what is a CDG?
Yeah, I mean, I have to bounce off the phrase card driven game, and if that's interesting that Gene came up with that makes total sense. I think with capital C, capital D, capital G, I think that was Gene. Yeah, and so it has to be, it means driven by cards, right? The action, the sequence of play, if you like. Such as it is driven by the play of cards. You have to play a card for anything to happen. And for me, it's a little more than that to be a capital C, capital D, capital G. I have to be able to see the genealogy in it. Like every game design has lineage, right? I mean, the innovations are twists on older things. It comes from somewhere. And what Mark was just describing was, a family tree, right? An evolution through the 90s and into the 2000s. So I want to see in that design, I want to be able to detect the lineage back to We the People. So if that narrows it a bit. So if I can see how the cards are influencing the actions moving forward, the sequence of play, the progress, the dynamics, the motion in the game, if I can see that traces back to We the People, then to me it's a CDG.
And actually on that point, the point about genealogy, I think is super interesting. And I just want to give a shout out to David Doctor, who on BGG had a thread around CDGs, and he made that awesome timeline where you have We the People and you have the different branches. And I think he did an amazing job at actually mapping it out and giving a broad sense of what is for him a CDG. And I think it goes really in the direction that what you were saying, Volko. You see the genealogy, but you also have the different branches that build up over time. And I think it's like the visualization that he made is really really awesome for that. And for you, Jason.
I guess well, I agree with everything that Volko and Mark have said, of course, but I guess the driven is the part for me of CDG that matters the most. Obviously, you can use cards in a variety of different ways, and if it's purely as a matter of operations where you're just deciding how many pieces can be moved on the board by virtue of flipping a card, that's one thing. But I think in any game where the cards provide the narrative arc of the game, then that's what really makes for a CDG. I'm curious though, if Volko, do you consider the coins derived from CDGs?
Derived? Absolutely. Oh, absolutely.
And that's actually a super interesting question, because thinking about it, I was trying to also on my mind trying to frame what I think is a CDG, and of course that genealogy aspect makes a lot of sense. And basically what you're saying is the multiple use of cards, the fact that you can use for events or for ops to interact with the board and everything, and the fact that you have that choice, and that most of the choice evolve around the opportunity that is given by the card. Think about it, it feels like coin is doing this because you either take the event or you take the ups. It's just that the ups are always the same in a way.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, I don't know what's in a word, right? It's semantics. So after a while, the debate becomes less interesting. But I would also go back to the distinction that Mark raised. To me, is if it's like, oh, let's play this CDG. Okay, I'm interested. Let's play a CDG. I like CDGs. I'm going to expect hand management. Right. And so with coin, yes, it's absolutely derived. There would be no coin if there was not if there was not We the People, Washington's War, etc. There would be no coin if there was no Labyrinth, which is right in that channel of genealogy as Mark described. But, I don't know, would you expect the cards to work the way they do in coin if somebody said, we're going to play a CDG? And I would not.
I would. You go ahead, Jason. It's fine.
Sorry. And I find there to be a little bit of a distinction between what we term a CDG in a game like Hammer of the Scots, which is a superb game, but it just doesn't have the. If I went over and someone said, let's play a CDG, and they pulled Hammer of the Scots down, that's not what I would expect.
Right. And to me, because I don't see We the People as a progenitor, I mean, maybe it is, I don't know, but I can't detect that lineage in Hammer.
And Mark, you were about to say something.
Yes. The thing that again, and I think it goes back to the Volko talk about genealogy. I always saw the choice of, like a typical CDG now would have a 1 through, like in Paths of Glory, it's got a 1. I don't actually, there's no ones, but you have a 2 to a 5 value. So you got 4 different values on the card, and you've got some kind of event, right? And because you've got split decks, you don't have to worry about, is it a German event or or an Allied event. But the basic point is that there is this choice. I think that's the important part, not how the card's constructed. So when I did We the People, the choice was at the hand level. So if you imagine a hand of cards is a bunch of choices between ops and events, what Mark did when he did Hannibal is he integrated every card into that choice, right? So that was the evolution from the hand choice to the card choice. And then Ted took it sort of like, why don't I just run every darn thing, mechanism in the game through the choice? You got your replacements that way and all that kind of stuff. And also, but I will tell you a quick story, but it is a quick story because I don't have the thing. When I did We the People, Mark Simonich was very interested in that system, obviously. He and I are very good friends. And so there was about a month of emails back and forth. This is like when there was like no AOLs, like Genie Network practically. And we kind of laid out what we thought were what is a CDG? We defined it for ourselves. And you have to remember, We the People had the battle card system also in it, right? So there was this whole, 2-level thing. Like when I get into battle, it was even more card oriented than came later. We took that kind of came out. In fact, I think the only 2 that have that system are Hannibal and We the People, if I'm not mistaken, of that genealogy.
In 1989?
Oh, of course. Oh, yeah, right. You got that great resolution.
Little known title, but it's
so there's the 3 that kept that sort of separate card-driven, mechanic in play. And I have to say, of the 3, probably 1989 does it the best because it's the most interesting. And it's most consequential, actually, because you're dealing with how a whole country is going to. Isn't that right, Jason? A whole country is decided based on that mechanic.
It was decided as an homage to your system, so take the compliment for what it's worth.
Thank you. But I think that when I think of Hammer of the Scots, it has. It has this idea that I've got a hand of cards and I'm going to pick ops, there's only a few events. So I think the events it's really an op-driven game, with, you could have done it with chits, you could have done it, so the card, it's just the fact that there's a couple of events usually, but there's not many. And I will tell you, one of the things that Mark and I spoke about long ago, which is something, I'm not going to call it a rule because there's no such thing as a rule in game design, right? But there was a feeling that if you had this numbering system, I've always favored the 1, 2, and 3, right? And Volko used the same exact one in Wilderness War, right? Wasn't it Volko 1, 2s, and 3s with an event? And isn't that the same also in Twilight Struggle, right? Am I right? Yeah, yeah. You know, I've been so lost in the Pacific lately, I don't know where the hell I am. So the point of that numerology is typically a 3 card's better than a 1 card, and that was always one of the things that bothered me. And Mark and I spoke about, how do you make a 1 card still not like, oh, I got screwed on the draw kind of thing. And that's where some of the more interesting events were supposed to go. In other words, you know, things that were interesting events, but they were low rated, means you would play the event. Oh, you would make the player choice easier by saying it's a 1 card, but man, this is a cool event, I'll go with the event. You know, because players are great at arbitrage, right? Where's my greater value? And in fact, I think in Empire of the Sun, the 1 cards are very powerful in the right circumstance. In fact, they're more powerful than 3 cards in the right circumstance. So that's always been sort of the challenge in some games. And the other thing we talked about in those email exchanges is, and you have to understand the card deck probability. You know, like what is the chance I'm going to draw this, that, or the other thing? And when you make too many cards contingent on other cards, the probability is that threat is never going to happen, because, you know, A has to happen before B, happens before C, happens before D, and you shuffle it all up. You know, that might only happen, 15% of the time. So you have to be very careful about like the use of mandatory events or events that require a triggering event is easily screwed up in a lot of games. I've seen that in a lot of CDGs that didn't really think that thing through, and that is one of their weaknesses. Actually, is that particular misnomer. And those are things that Mark and I spoke about before he did Hannibal long ago.
Can I bounce off of something Mark just said there?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's just so interesting about this, whether you pair the more or less interesting events with the lower ops numbers. It just really made me think of Scott Moore's This War Without an Enemy, just out recently. And now I'm like, I'm not sure is it a CDG? Because most of the cards have events on them, and most of the cards have ops, but it owes its lineage pretty directly to Hammer of the Scots and Crusader Rex even more explicitly, I think. And the way that Scott solves that exact problem is when you play the card, you get the whole card, and it's either 4 ops and no event, 3 ops and a weak event, or 2 ops and a strong event. So it's not at all the same choice as in Hannibal Road versus Carthage, but is that from CDG? I don't know. I'd have to ask him, like, where did that come from CDG, Scott, or not?
But that's directly the same usage as in Crusader Rex. The cards are used the same way, and you don't have a decision. Like, because in Crusader Rex you have no, it's actually different, because in Crusader Rex the event doesn't have any ups. But I mean,
Crusader Rex is like Hammer of the Scots, yeah.
But you don't have a choice when you're playing the card. It's like it's either for ups and it happens, or it would be limited ups. But you will play your whole hand.
The sequence is different for those games. For the Jerry Taylor games, you both play a card face down. You flip them up. The higher ops goes first, or if it goes first. Yeah. It's different. It's different. But
yeah. By the way, just so you know, the game, there is a game that I like. It's a CDG, Hearts and Minds. And Hearts and Minds definitely has that, that sort of that middle choice, right? In other words, you get like X amount of ops. I don't remember what the numbers are, but let's say you get 3 ops for argument's sake. You can use 2 of those ops to get the event, and you still have 1 op, or there's a cost for the event out of your. So you get like a budget, and you can use that budget all for ops, or you can use some of the budget to buy the event and do some ops, and some that are just. Or maybe the events in some cases are so expensive. It's
brilliant. It's brilliant. I love Hearts and Minds, and it actually, a similar solution is in one of my top 3 CDGs, but I'll save that for later.
Yeah, I just would like to bring up a question from Alan here, and I think that I will probably ask that question to Jason and see if the 2 of you want to build up on this. But there is a question from Alan that goes in the direction of something that I wanted to ask. He's talking about the impression that he has is that CDG is particularly useful for political conflict, or to also encompass the political aspect of a conflict. And that's also something that came up when I was preparing that show on the discussion, is that feeling that most CDGs, even if they are war games, they don't only depict war, and there are usually a political element to it, that it's not purely about military operations. And I just wanted to have your thought about, is this a key element, core element of what is a CDG, or that's just one a side effect of using the cards and the events?
I mean, for me, obviously, it is a core element. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that one of the things that I think is most brilliant about the We the People system was the insight that you can quantify political power just as easily as you quantify military power. Because up until then, war games had control markers, and that represented a lot of different things. But we didn't really have a lot of war games. I mean, I'm not saying none. I'd have to go through. There's a long lineage of these things, but there weren't a lot of war games where you were quantifying political power and putting it on a board and give it a geographic representation the same way that We the People did. And that was really the insight that brought Twilight Struggle to the fore, because that was the thing we were like, oh, eureka, you can do the same thing with diplomatic and political power that we do with putting chits on a mat and moving them around hexes. I do think that it's not a necessary part of a CDG. It just played an extremely interesting little CDG about the Battle of Santa Cruz, which is a British amphibious landing.
Ivan Kathos.
It has no political component at all, but it is clearly a CDG. But it does help bring the political component into warfare, particularly well at the strategic level, and even more so, I think, in conflicts that have a high political component. I mean, they all do in a way, but more acutely in civil wars and that sort of thing, where you expect a very high political component, and it's never very well represented just by military units on hexes. And so, yes, while it's not a requirement of the genre, it certainly is a feature of it.
Would you agree with that, Mark?
Well, as I said earlier, when I did We the People, it was meant to be a hearts and minds game. In other words, it was an insurgency. And so at its core, it was a political game where there was military stuff supporting the politics versus where the politics was sort of layered on. It was a political game from the very beginning, because you get control. And it's actually, if you know, because of the isolation rules, there is a form of political combat. It's kind of I use the the famous Wei Chi Go system for surrounding, but the idea was that as long as you can expand your base, then your political movement's growing. And once you're hemmed in, if you don't have some way of offering protection to that base, then it'll just wither and die. And so you had this thing where all you had to do is get some troops in there and it's fine. But if you don't use the military to support the political is the main game. You don't win, but you can win 100 battles in that game and still lose the game. It's all about colony control. But if you ignore how the military supports that political movement or how the military puts down that political movement, then you haven't figured out the game. So it's always been a political military. And in fact, almost all the CDGs I have done, with the exception of one, are straight political military games.
And just to follow up on your question, Volko, about Scott, we have Scott actually in the chat who's actually saying that. So hey, Scott, thanks for joining. He said that was definitely CDGs in probably at least CDGs in the back of his mind when he worked on this war without an enemy. By the way, just a shameless plug, we played Scott's game with Scott, Teach and Play, last week. So if you want to check that out, if you want to check this war without an enemy, amazing game, beautiful game, really cool. Almost a CDG, so that's very thematic, and that's it. I have just a quick, maybe more in the direction of defining the scope of what are CDGs. One last question on the taxonomy part. We have Riccardo Massini, who's just asking a question, and I don't know if you know that system, but he's asking, would you describe the Napoleon series, so Napoleon 1806, Napoleon 1807, and the future Napoleon 1815 by Shaco's Games as CDGs? And I don't know if you know those games. You can probably see them here, but I don't know if any of you have played them.
I have not played them. I've been looking at pictures on the web. admiringly, but I have not played them.
Good, but then then I would have no answer. I can answer. My answer is no. It's not, because you have no decisions. It's like it is. The cards are at the core of the system. It drives the system, but you don't have choice between ops or event. And I don't think that it necessarily applies based on the discussion that we had. But I think that's probably for another time. And I have maybe one last question around that to close that first part, and that's even maybe a philosophical question. But what is a card? Like literally, what it is supposed to represent? What it is an abstraction of? And I guess that the answer is probably different depending on the game that we're looking at. But I would be curious to have your opinion on what you think a card is abstracting. And maybe we can start with you, Mark.
Well, one of the things that, and I actually wrote a column on this a long time ago. If you go to an actual military commander or a leader, I'm talking about a very senior leader, and you say to them, what is the thing that you do when you do your thing? And they'll tell you that they're always about managing risk and uncertainty, trying to accomplish something. They're trying to get something done with risk and uncertainty. That's the basic thing you'll hear. You can hear it different ways, but they all say the same thing. And when I was a senior, leader, that was how I looked at it. And what you find is that the cards, for the most part, are representing. There's only so much time in any day, and so if you're President Lincoln in the Civil War, if you're in the middle of a political crisis, you're not paying attention to the war. And if you're in the middle of the war, you're paying attention to the war. Their political things are kind of getting out of hand, and so you always got this political military balance going on. And the card is the metaphor of that set of choices, those metaphorical choices, because if you think, and then people say, well, I can do all those things, and I will tell you that I have been, and I know Volko also, and Jason's been involved at very high levels, and we've all been actually involved in very senior things in the U.S. Government and military, and I will tell you that senior bandwidth is not infinite. Things fall on the floor. He's smiling. Things fall on the floor because this right now is more important than that, and then all of a sudden something else becomes more important, and so the game is representing those senior decision choices, and the idea that you can do everything is just not true, and coordinating things is rare, not normal. And hex and counter games made that normal. The way Tactics 2 plays, I can move some, all, or none of my pieces. That is a brilliant extension of chess. Right? In chess, I move, you move, and you can create combinations, but I got to kind of set it up, and then all of a sudden the combination plays out. But what Charles Roberts did was he said, hey, you can do this combination all the time. And that's why they're so darn fun, because you could just create these elaborate combinations. You could do the same thing in a CDG, but you've got to figure out the sequencing of balancing what the situation is and whether I'm going to go more political or more military at this moment based on the circumstances. Those choices are real. And I think when you take those choices away, that's the abstraction, not the cards.
Jason, I saw you reacting a lot when Mark was talking. Would you?
Yeah, well, Mark was saying something about senior decision makers' capacity for decision making is not infinite. It's not even particularly plentiful, as far as I can tell. But I agree with. I think that's a very clever characterization that a card represents the dilemma of a decision maker in whether to sort of pursue their plan or whether to react to the circumstances around them. I also kind of look at them in the broader scope of what the game is doing, that it's a moment in time, and we're going to have however many moments in time defined by the deck, and we're going to sequence those, and all together it tells a narrative arc. Like, this is the story of the game, and the story of the game is told by making one micro decision after another, kind of navigated by the decks and the cards and the events on them.
Would you agree with that also, Volko?
I would, and to maybe go a little more into the specifics in the CDG form, the answer to me relates back to the question about, is this a particularly good way to show political conflicts? And the answer is yes, and then some. So to me, the cards are so wonderful because they allow all kinds of things that are of different disciplines and influences on the situation, other than what's at the core. And that's how I think of the cards in CDGs. To be a CDG, the card has to drive actions, and it has to offer, or sometimes offer, events. And what's the difference between those two? What do those two represent? The actions always go back to a menu. There's a thing I can do. Maybe it's move the army. Maybe it's convert political control of a space. Maybe, as in Paths of Glory, I can do strategic redeployments, or I can add forces, whatever. The events are specific then to that card. That represents the first one. The actions on the card represents whatever the core processes are. The designer is basically making a choice and saying, well, I'm mainly going to focus in on the maneuver of armies, let's say. And that and the conversion of hearts and minds where the armies are on specific spaces, whatever. That's the actions. But then there's all kinds of other things, almost infinite other things, whatever that is, that influences that core military activity, or that core diplomatic activity, or that core political activity. And that's where you then bring it in very neatly with the card, because your rule is right there. You bring in whatever that is. Now, that might be politics, that might be economics, that might be culture, that might be a specific personality, a leader, a politician. It might be, in some cases, acts of nature. It might be tactics. If you're at the operational level, you're focused in on operations of the movement, maneuver of armies. But every once in a while, there's something important like a battle, and you want to bring in certain tactical twists. That can be on the cards. Or if you're at the operational level and you want to bring in higher level, strategical impacts on the armies, you can bring that in with cards, whatever you want. So you've got a core process or set of processes, the designer saying that's the focus, that's the narrative we're telling. And then you've got all those other things, which are the uncertainties and risks, if you will, that might happen, might not happen, might happen, but not in a way that affects anything. And that's then represented by the shuffling of the deck and the deal and the hard hands and so forth.
And one question on the definitions part, just to bring it up, because it was also something that was brought up in discussions, and we have Ricardo that is asking this in the chat. Oh, we lost Jason. And the question is, no, that's not the one. The elephant's room is combat commander. Then, based on the discussion that we had, would you put combat commander in the CDG category or not? Maybe starting with you, Volko, because you made a really weird face. So I think you have.
Oh my goodness, yes. Oh my goodness, I would. I don't know if Gene Billingsley does, but I absolutely see in Combat Commander the lineage going back of the card with actions and ops menus and events, different ways to play the card, driving the narrative. And to me, Combat Commander represents the second phase. I wouldn't call it a traditional CDG, but I would call it a part of the evolution to actually greater possibilities.
Would you agree with that, Mark?
So I think I think Volko's characters. So let's say that if you ever looked at the family tree of humans, right? There's Lucy, and I think they just found recently a skull that was in China, and they're saying that's another, who knows? But the point is that there's sequels and branches that come off of all these things, and I think all things that I've ever done, I stood on the shoulders of giants long before me. So, like when I did Empire of the Sun, I think of Empire of the Sun the way I would think about Combat Commander. Not that they're similar to each other at all, but they're taking that mechanical function of how to use the cards, and where I always came from is the CDG had to be an area control game, right? That was always my that's where I started it all from. So I always thought of it as a political military struggle with this, this trade space. When I did Empire of the Sun, I was looking literally to redo how you think about hex and counter games. So it was stepping away from the political. There is a political dimension to Empire of the Sun, but it's not through the cards. I mean, a little bit through the cards, but not much. And it also used the cards to handle the wider war. But it is a hex and counter game using the card-driven mechanic, and it is a CDG, but it's a second evolution. And I think that, and again, I've never had a conversation with Chad about this in particular. I've worked with him, but we never talked about this. So I don't know what he was thinking when he went to Combat Commander, but it clearly has that, you don't do anything without cards. And I think I saw, I've actually got the YouTube live stream on with the sound off, of course, over here, just so I can see the questions faster. And and Up Front always comes up. And
yeah,
and when I think about Up Front, first off, it's a brilliant game. I love it. Up Front's lineage is squad leader. In other words, what they were trying to do was a quick and dirty game of squad leader without all, the 14,000 pages of rules. And so Up Front was a brilliant game, but its intent, and you can say, well, it uses cards and the game is driven by cards, but there's also no map, there's no area control, there's no, it doesn't have all those other elements. It is fundamentally it's squad leader with cards, terrain and jumping around and all that. And I love the game, by the way. I have all the, every variant I've played it. We play it frequently. A guy named Hawkeye and I play it when we can. It's a fabulous game, but it just comes from a whole different, mindset where it was going. So people always bring it up, and they're trying to take the Gene Billingsley, branding, card driven, in its literal sense, which a lot of gamers do. They take everything literally, especially, they can parse a rule like nobody's business to get literal, when they want to get something to happen in a game. But ultimately, you're not dealing with you're dealing with a marketing definition when you try to push the word card driven through everything. And I think Volko's done a great job of sort of saying this is what it's the intent and mechanics of it that matter, not whether you can say there's a card and it's driven or it's those choices. Let me put it this way: squad leader doesn't have any choices. You play a card to either move or shoot. And in fact, in some ways, you could say that Combat Commander might bring some of that. Again, without Chad here to talk about it, I have no idea, but I see elements of Up Front in Combat Commander actually, because of, again, but you don't have to worry about you actually move pieces, but there is elements of that in it.
Yeah, I mean, Combat Commander clearly has squad leader and Up Front in its lineage as well, right?
Yeah.
But I think we'll maybe stop here about maybe the lineage and the definition, because I think there is a lot of those questions about this CDG, not CDG, and I think we could spend the whole evening about pick a game. Is it a CDG? And then it never stops. But it was an interesting chat, and I think now what I would like us to start talking about is about the current state of CDGs. So maybe looking at the last 5-10 years maximum, looking at the evolution that you've seen over the past half decade or a decade. And here the question that I have for you is that what are the most interesting innovations that you've seen to the CDG system in the last 5 to 10 years? And like in the usage of events or the application to different scales or to different topics, what really struck you as interesting evolution of the system? And now that Jason is back, maybe we can start with Jason. You could see moving a lot back there.
So I guess the thing that the single game that most intrigued me was the application of a CDG to a courtroom setting. That was Al Berry did. I mean, what can only be described as incredibly obscure history for most Americans, but Al Berry did a trial-based CDG called High Treason, and it's about the trial of Louis Riel, who was a kind of a
Canadian guy,
revolutionary in Canada.
You're gonna drive people insane, because I think the game is extremely hard to find. It was a victory point game, right?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad. I don't even remember who who pointed it out to me, but I was so glad to track it down because it turned out to be it's quite a entertaining game as well. So so that concept definitely got me thinking, and I think in general there has been a lot of great work both in the application and in exploring topics that have never really been explored before. You know, Dan Bullock has got a game on an existing game on North Korea, No Motherland Without, and he's got a new one coming out on the 1979 revolution in Iran. I think both of those kinds of topics are very exciting and not the sort of thing that Americans had been producing war games about traditionally. And, you know, and I also tend to like these little games that pack a big punch in a short amount of time. So Santa Cruz, which I mentioned earlier, but also Kevin Bertram's Shores of Tripoli. Again, the history is a little off the beaten path, and that always appeals to me. And you have all this stuff ready, so that's perfect.
I'm trying. Like and Shores of Tripoli is there. You have to make me move a lot. So this is the yeah.
Yes,
and just
faster. So I think that stuff is incredibly exciting in terms of the innovations in games themselves. The other thing that I can't remember the title of it, but these little micro CDGs I think are a very interesting idea, where it's, you know, 10 cards or 12 cards or whatever. There's one on I think there's one on one of the Roman rebellions in England. I think maybe Volko or
it's a micro coin tribes, a very small one, but it's I don't know if it qualifies as a CTG or as a mini or as a mini coin. We went through this, Jason. We said no, coins are not CTGs. You're ruining the whole. So that doesn't qualify. But yeah, there is actually in that range there is a small one that was released recently. I think this one. So it's actually originally a Japanese design, published by a French publisher, Nuts Publishing 300. But it's more in the lunchtime category, so a lot like Mark Herman's Fort Sumter, for example, in that scope. Not micro, but definitely a way smaller scale, games that can be played in 40 minutes.
Is Paris Commune CDG?
Red Flag Over Paris? Oh yeah, 100%. It is the game that made me want to make that game was Fort Sumter. When I played Fort Sumter, I wanted to make a game on the Paris Commune for a long time and was frustrated about how I should make it, and I really didn't know. And when I played Fort Sumter, after my first game, I was like, oh, now I know. Like, it was suddenly painfully obvious. It's like, this is the system that I need to use. I probably need to change it, and I changed it significantly by some aspects, but the core of it is definitely that. And for me, Fort Sumter is a pure CDG, a concentrated form of a CDG. But and I don't know if Mark could disagree, but for me, it is definitely 100% a CDG. And Mark is thinking, now I'm super worried that I said something stupid. And he's like, no.
He's about to tell you your game is not a CDG.
I'm a happy guy. I'm just listening.
Good. Yeah, and actually on my side, there was one innovation that I was super impressed by, and I don't know if any of you have played Flashpoint South China Sea by Harold Buchanan. And when we were talking about definition and the fact that one of the core aspects of CDG is how you use the card and the choice that you have to make, and the decision-making part. The thing that, and I don't know if it existed in another game, but for me, it was the first time that I saw it. The fact that when you play a card, you can play it for ops, you can play it for the event. And there is this layer that I've never seen, is that a card is also a scoring card. So like in Twilight Struggle, the scoring is not separate. Is not a separate card. It actually, every card is a scoring card. And you have that trade-off of deciding, am I going to use it for ups or am I going to score now? And you have the whole layer of hand management and knowing how many times can you score in a turn, when do you need to score the different things. And I thought it was like mind-blowing. And it seems obvious when you see it, But I was thinking, why didn't I think about it? Like it was quite. And I don't know if Jason, you've played that.
I did.
That game.
I think it's a brilliant design. I'm really looking forward to having a hard copy of it soon.
And you, Mark, on your side, is there any things when you're looking back over the 5-10 years, CDGs, any innovation that you were inspired by, surprised by, things that really struck you?
I would say that I'm looking over here, so I know it's over there somewhere. So there was sort of like this, explosion of CDGs, and there was a group of them that was good, and there was a group of them that kind of like were misguided and didn't do that well. But the whole bunch of them came out in the 90s and the early 21st century, and then it kind of petered out for quite a while. It really, I did Empire of the Sun in 2005, and Amateur in Arms was somewhere around that period of time, which is a really good CDG, and all that. It seems to be making a resurgence. So the one that I've really liked, I've played lately, is Bayonets and Tomahawks. Is that the way it goes? Yeah, Bayonets and Tomahawks. Yeah. Really cool. It's a card-driven game, but I think it leans very heavily. It kind of tries to cut the difference between coin having two cards that are visible and having a hand of like two cards. So there is some choices, because you've got this you always get this reserve card as you cycle through, and who has the initiative and all this kind of stuff. So I think I like the way that Rodrigue did use the coin card-driven kind of genre in a new way, I think. I think that I've seen, the other thing that has come along, I had a French intervention track in We the People, a mechanic for the French intervening, and I expanded upon it. I've seen if you're talking about like changes, using the cards to drive tracks, as a part of, you play this card and the war in Europe changes, as opposed to some other direct action on the board. So you sort of use the cards to bring in sort of the broader picture of every game has a sort of an edge of the world function, right? You go to here and you can't go any further in the context. But I think that that's been something that I've seen in CDG. But I think Bayonets and Tomahawks has sort of done some cool things, and in fact, what is it called? 13 Days, which is a really nice of the small CDGs. They use it it's how you affect those 3 crisis tracks, right? You can blow the world up, kind of thing. During that crisis. So I think that's been sort of the thing that I've noticed, is using the cards to drive tracks, which bring in other elements onto themselves. There you go. Oh, I guess it must be the French version.
Yeah, that's the French version.
I could read it, but I said that doesn't say, that's not days, that's Jules. But anyway, so I think that's what I've seen. Volko, what do you got?
Well, I'll bounce off of a comment from Riccardo Massini and agree with them. The one that comes to my mind in terms of recent CDG innovation that is for me very exciting and promising is Verdun 1916 Steel Inferno by Walter Wadowski, and it covers the Battle of Verdun, which it's a single battle, but it's a giant battle, so it's really operational level trench warfare. And I've always been fascinated with how do we simulate the dynamics of trench warfare, because they're so weird on the West. World War I Western Front is kind of weird in the history of warfare. And what Walter does in that game is leverages these various tools within the classic CDG of how do we link the action menu to events. How do cards do that? And so John Paniski and Hearts and Minds did it a little differently, where you could spend some of your ops to get the event also, for example. And there's a similar relationship in the cards in Verdun. It's hard to explain because it's really, it's a complex system. But in short, the way that he engineered into the cards, the way the cards are built, engineers into the card play World War I trench warfare style offensives and the difficulties of following up, and the scripted and long buildup nature of barrages and offensives, and the fact that you then had to kind of stop and pause, and the enemy had a chance to come back. Well, all of that is just, built in. It's just a joy to play, because you don't have to know a lot of rules to actually see how these trench battles worked out in such a way that once if you're expecting World War II, World War I trench battles seem really weird. Like, why couldn't they do more? And it's, for example, the artillery cards, you can use them for ops or just for the barrage. And the barrage, you always need artillery. The barrage is the only way to attack, which means if you're going to attack, you're not going to be moving. Other cards, might give you an event plus a few ops. Anyway, it's just very cleverly engineered, making use of these basic relationships among CDG cards going back to the 90s, but to bring out the unique dynamics of trench warfare just in a way I haven't seen.
And by the way, I was a playtester on that.
Really? Well, you did a fantastic job.
No. Walter's a very old friend of mine. He's
is that right?
Walter and I have been together for a long time, so I know him very, very well. Him and Frederick, Frederick and I go way back also. But you're exactly right. And by the way, the point I wanted to make was, of all the CDGs, nothing comes close to the artwork on Verdun. I mean, it is the best freaking card artwork on any game. That style, that famous artist he got to do the cards is just extraordinary.
Yeah, it's really a beautiful game with the illustration from Tardy. It's really awesome that they actually secured that. It's really cool. And actually, there was a comment in the chat from Joe Dewhurst, and I'm actually happy that for once Joe is watching the show, so that's really nice. And Joe Dewhurst was asking about Wir sind das Volk, and I don't know if you know this game, and I think it's an interesting one, and it makes a good transition to a discussion that I wanted to have with you about what is the hand management part of the game and the role of the deck. In Wir sind das Volk, each player have a small hand, but they also share a market. So you could say that they have their own hand, but they also share a hand in the middle. And I was wondering, is this something that you thought is thought-provoking, that makes sense in most of the game, or what do you see the limits in that? I think it's a really interesting twist on it, because it really cements the idea that cards are opportunities that you can make decision on. And you have this dual layer of, I'm going to play a card for ops or the event, but you also have that other layer of, can I afford to wait to activate this event, or can I let my opponent taking the event from me? And I was thinking, have you tried the game, and what do you think about that mechanic and how it uses cards in a novel way? And maybe we can start with you, Jason. Yeah.
Well, I think it's an incredibly clever game, and I very much enjoy it. I think in some, maybe, since I know Ananda has also played it, I think in some non-express ways, it probably influenced the way we thought about Imperial Struggle and the common market for operations there, because you end up with that same kind of tension that you see in Wir sind das Volk, where you need to grab this now or potentially forego the opportunity, or do I want to wait to set it up properly with the cards? That it's a similar tension.
And I don't know if any of you, Volko or Mark, actually played this game.
So I have not played the game, so I have no comment on the game. I'm sure it's great. I was going to say, though, the way you were talking about a market and such, my old, so most game designers are not rocket scientists, but one of them is. That's Phil Eklund. And Phil has a style of game which, again, since having not seen the other game, I can't even say they're even comparable. But Phil's use cards. It's a card game, and he doesn't even have maps. He uses the cards to create if there's any kind of map, but it's kind of more of a virtual map. But like if you play Pax Pamir, which is really Cold Whirly, but using Phil's system, or Renaissance, which is one of my favorites of that whole genre. Of course, you got Pax Porfiriano, I think is the title of the game. He's got this, market, but what he's using the cards there is that those are opportunities think of it like political opportunities to change how you're going to even go after victory in the game. So right now I could be on this is the faction I'm sort of supporting, but look, there's a lot of cool ways for me to screw that faction and get onto this other faction, become another person in this game. And so I think that's a kind of a cool thing. But again, it's definitely not a CDG, it's a card game. But what you described sounded like that with the market, and the further back in the market it is, the more it costs, and the more it's this way, it's cheaper. And there's a lot of games that kind of use that kind of mechanic of a market.
So this one is actually quite different from the coin system, because the coin system, it's a bit the same thing with the expenses, that further away the card is, the more expensive it's going to be to get it.
The pack system?
In the pack system, and also in the expense by Geoff. But in Virsintas Volk, every card are at the same cost. It's just that you have you have that trade-off of, can I afford to wait? And that's more the currency that you have is more time that you're playing with. But in every other aspect, in the way it uses card, it is purely a CDG, I would say, and it reminds a lot of maybe more 1989 regarding the topics and everything. But it has this aspect, and for me, it makes a transition to another question that I had for you. Is there is something that is in CDGs? There, you could say there is two school of thoughts, or maybe not school of thoughts, but two approaches when you're making such a game. Is that some games don't have a shared deck and you have a deck per faction, and some do. And I was wondering, when do you think this makes sense, and why make that separation or not? And maybe we can start with you, Volko.
Yeah, why not? If you have, how many events do you have that either side could use? How much do you want to have a sort of a script for the development of each position? That might be a reason you would choose to do it separately or not. But in Labyrinth, I copied Twilight Struggle with the idea that you have cards you're going to draw that are your opponent's events, and you're going to trigger that event for your opponent if you use the actions. And it was because I had enjoyed the decision making from that mechanic so much from Twilight Struggle, and because the genealogy of that game happened to be, what if we took Twilight Struggle and put it, in the War on Terror? I could have, I suppose, just as easily gone with two separate decks. The sides are very asymmetrical. You can see how it makes sense. So I don't know if I have for you, and maybe Jason or Mark or you, Fred, do. I don't know that I have a kind of a modeling rule as to when I would go with separate decks versus combined decks. I like the chaos of the combined decks, I guess, as a player. I guess I see the world as more chaotic. And if you have your own deck, now you're running through it, you kind of know a little bit more what you're going to get, because it's all there in your deck and you know what your opponent's going to get. That might be sensible. That might reflect the state of awareness on the part of the historical parties. I guess I tend to see it more as, who knows who's going to get what, so I like to put them together. It's a pretty simplistic answer, but I guess that's my answer.
And maybe you, Jason, just maybe your thoughts on it, about this idea of having decks separated or not, and what does it? Yeah,
I do have kind of a rule of thumb about it, which is I'm thinking about how much control do both players have over the same set of events that are going to be in the deck. So in a situation where, like in the Cold War, or obviously in Labyrinth, where both participants are in some ways reacting to and participating in all of the same set of global events, then I think that combined deck methodology makes more sense. In a case where, like Imperial Struggle, where you have you have a global scope, in point of fact, communications and the rest of it are not in a situation at that time in human history where England and France can both react to the same set of events at the same time and manipulate them in the same way, then I think separate decks make more sense, because to a greater degree, the players are pursuing their own plans and competing their plans rather than reacting to outside forces imposed on them.
What would you say, Mark?
So I sort of think of it like there are three separate axes here in my mind. Okay, the first one is, and I even wrote a column called "To Script or Not to Script" about CDGs, and it is my view that where I have been unsuccessful and others like and Jason and Nanda were much more successful is people like to know maybe the elements of the story happen in different order, but they like to know that all the elements of the story are going to be there. There's going to be this kind of crisis is going to come up somewhere, and you're going to have to deal with it. So when you have to deal with it is the issue, not that you're going to end up dealing with it most of the time. I know you can bury cards in the space race and all that, but for the most part, there's a story arc, which is the Cold War, and there's a certain predictableness to it. I lean more than the other axis is how much do you want to not script it? And so when you don't want it scripted, putting a combined, so one way around it, in Twilight Struggle, which is obviously the most successful CDG of all time, it's a combined deck, but all the events are, and again, I use this with the caveat that the events are all mandatory, right? It's like if I'm holding a hand of, I'm on the Americans, I'm holding 5 Russian events, I can get rid of one of them through the space race or a couple of things, little tricks I can use, but ultimately those 5 events are going to happen. All I get to choose is what order they're going to come out in. Okay, so that's one way of handling the combined deck. The other way to look at a combined deck is to say, okay, I don't want every event that happened historically to actually happen. I want some deletions in the story. And so I get a hand of cards and I go, okay, let's call it For the People. I've got 3 rebel events, but I have to use them as ops. And I've got 4 Union events, so I can use them as ops or the event. And so the Confederate events aren't going to happen. And the Confederate player doesn't know, oh, I really wish I could get that card. I don't know that the Union player's already played it until he discards it and uses it, that card is not going to be one of the elements of my strategy. You got to be a little bit more flexible. The other axis I look at is how much do you want the card decks to reflect different philosophy? I mean, political philosophy, military philosophy, for whatever. And so then I started thinking about 2 separate decks. And so when I did Empire of the Sun, how the Japanese were organized and how they fought and how they even, were going to deal with the war is just very different than what the U.S. was going to do. And so to try to use a combined deck there in a military game with not much politics, I wanted the 2 decks to reflect the organizational military structure that drove those organizations. And so I used 2 separate decks. Now, what I do to get around the problem of, I know what's going to come up is I always make the deck. I always some guy wrote me and said, why does For the People have 130 cards? It's too many cards. And I kept thinking of that scene from Amadeus, it has as many notes as I wanted it to have, and so, and I like a big deck because ultimately you're not going to see all the cards. And so that's sort of the extra element of it all is you don't get to see it all. You can't predict it. And let's face it, Lincoln never sat down and said, okay, when am I going to get that, emergency call for volunteers card? I really need it now. And he never thought that way, right? So I also want to reflect the fact that, like right now, look what's going on in Cuba. Look what's going on in Haiti. Look what's going on with us pulling out of Afghanistan. And now you have to tell me that if I was playing a CDG of this right now, what's the next card? I have no idea what's going to happen next. And so the people in the time period didn't know what was going to happen next. So why should you? That's my answer on, how much scripting is reasonable from a historical point of view. They just didn't have that control over the situation.
Can I just mention, because that makes me think of another innovation in CDGs that we haven't mentioned yet, but I think is for me important. And that is to try to kind of walk the line between, we have a lot of combined events and chaos that anybody could end up deploying, but each of the sides, each of the player factions, whatever, have their own approach, culture, organization, or whatever that you want to reflect in the cards. And what I'm thinking of is home cards that that Mark McLaughlin has in the Napoleonic Wars and other games, and I think Ed Beach has used as well in his games. So you have a combined deck with all the chaos that you may want, but you also have some guaranteed things, special things that you can do, and those cards You always get them. They refresh, and they work the same or pretty much the same as other CDG cards, but they're not a whole separate deck. They're just a small set that gives a specific personality to your role in the game.
Yeah, I agree with that, by the way, and I think that when I did Churchill, Roosevelt's always there, unless he dies, but Churchill's always there, and in Pericles, you have your leader card. So I forgot about that, but was one of the great innovations, was to use the home cards in Napoleonic Wars. Absolutely.
Jason, you wanted to say something?
Along those lines, I would note that one of the evolutions and one of the fixes to the problem Mark identified about sequencing in decks and important event sequences is this idea of using home cards to resolve the sequencing problem. And I think that's in Shores of Tripoli, but a couple of other games have solved the when am I allowed to make this invasion problem or whatever by that same approach.
Right, you basically get to. In fact, I have played Shores of Tripoli. It's a lot of fun. You get when you pull that card, you can hold it on the side for a while. It gives you some limitations, but basically, that when you want to invade Derna or something like that, you already know where the card is. See, one of the things that I've going back to the deck management thing, you can use the discard pile is your friend if you think about it that way. In other words, the ability to go fish at some cost is an important element in how you deal with the sequencing issue. So in other words, if you're playing Empire of the Sun and early in the game, Operation Downfall occurs, the invasion of Japan, it goes into the discard deck. You use it as a 3 card, but you also know it's in the discard deck, and there are cards that allow you to, dump a card and pull a card. So you always know where the invasion is when you need it. So you can use the discard pile in a similar way, as long as you have a mechanic that allows you to fish into the discard pile at some cost.
I guess this also makes me think of sometimes if you do have separate decks for different players, you are encouraging effects of when you said deck management, of trimming your own deck in a certain way. And it's kind of maybe the opposite issue of a deck building game, where I've got remove events. If I play this card as an event, it's gone. That card's out. And if I use it for ops or discard it, it's still in. And so now I'm shaping my own deck. And that seems like it would be a powerful design tool if it were purposeful. I'm not sure it's always been used in a purposeful way with separate deck games. And I'm not referring here to Empire of the Sun, but other examples I have in my head, as opposed to something that just, to me, seems like an artifact. I think that's because that's so powerful to shape your own deck. The designer really needs to think about what is the history I'm representing with that mechanic, which is not an issue so much if it's a combined deck where you're both drawing, or you've got 130 cards and you're only going to play 60 of them.
And it's actually a big side effect of Path of Glory, where you're going to try to trim it as much as you can to have only the big ops value cards later down the line. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Actually, there was this game, I don't know if you guys played it, Time of Crisis, where actually the deck building part of it makes a lot of sense, because it's just you're building influence, you're making your own organization more and more efficient. And in that sense, I feel like it represents something historically. But would you say that it's the same in Path of Glory, or it's more of a side effect of the system? And I was seeing you, Jason, nodding a lot.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I have no idea whether that was a design choice or not, but it is definitely an important part of good play, right? If you're trying to be competitive at Path of Glory, that deck trimming, so that you make sure you've only got the high ops cards towards the end.
And actually going back to this, because I think there is a question that directly connects to this, is how do you feel about people actually learning the deck? And that's a question from NB here. People learning the deck to become more proficient at the game. And I know we talked about Chaos, and Mark was talking about having massive decks, so you can actually do that. But I think it's a big part of Twilight Struggle It's also in a way a part of Labyrinth, because you go through the deck multiple times. But then it also counteracts that effect, because you actually see the deck multiple times across the game. But yeah, how do you feel about having in the game that aspect that knowing the deck is an important part of learning the game? And maybe we can start with you, Jason, because I think, yeah.
I mean, I don't really, even though I hear this sometimes as a ding about Twilight Struggle, that, oh, well, no one, if you're playing against an experienced player, you don't have a chance. I don't know a lot of war games where that is not the dynamic, where, experience with the game is not an important advantage when playing against someone with significantly less exposure. But in early playtesting, one of the playtesters told me that Twilight Struggle was going to be a very successful tournament game for that very reason. And I got very comfortable with that idea very quickly.
And for you, Volko, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I don't have any problem with somebody feeling that a game I've designed is played more effectively by more experienced players. I mean, that's great. So there's skill in the game, Yeah, good. It's not all just a luck. What I hesitate on is what Mark mentioned, and that is from the modeling point of view, from the historical simulation point of view. Lincoln did not know the deck. Nobody knows the deck. They're going through, they don't even know the rules. I mean, I worked with an instructor of intelligence analysts, and we used games in classroom, and he would always say, don't worry so much about not knowing all the rules. In real war, they don't know all the rules, right? Everybody's playing it for the first time historically, so it's nice to the degree to which you can make it seem that way through chaos, like a big shuffled single card deck, for example. Even for experienced players are kind of like, well, they don't really know what's going to happen. That's, for me, a modeling benefit.
And I think that could potentially end up the discussion on the current states of CDGs. Oh, actually, there was one question that was earlier. I cannot find it anymore, but there was a general question. I think we can go quick over it around the role of flavor text. And I know there was a lot of discussion around flavor text with Amabel Holland's latest game, The Vote, that didn't have flavor text, and a lot of people reacted to the fact that there was not flavor text on the cards. And she actually made a very interesting article about the role of flavor text. And I just wanted to have maybe quickly to close that section, your point of view on what you feel about flavor text and its role that it has, especially on the CDG, because you have so much space for historical flavor. Maybe starting with you, Mark.
Yeah, let's call it the good, the bad, and the ugly is how I'll characterize this thing, right? So the good part is you play this card, and it's got this, it's got a picture, it's got a title, and you kind of know, the historical event that's what do you call it, the inspiration for the card, right? So that's the good part, right? The bad part is that, some folks are very literal. So in other words, I in the Empire of the Sun, I have this kamikaze cards, right? And I worked it out mathematically that you're going to get to play one, maybe two kamikaze events during the whole game, but then otherwise I use it as a 2-card. It's just a standard utility 2-card, like a utility infielder. And for some people, I hear it all the time. I got a kamikaze card. There were no kamikazes. I want my deck to have, early, mid, and late, and all this kind of stuff. So that's the bad side of flavor text, is that if it comes up early when it's, a late event or however that works, for some people that creates cognitive dissonance. And so I think that, there's a good and a bad side of it. But there was something that Jason said that I want to. So I actually am starting to write a book. But one of the inspirations that I have always had was Ken Burns. Does brilliant documentaries on history. And if you get down to the mechanics of a Ken Burns, documentary, it's a CDG in its own right. In other words, you tell this 6 or 7 minute vignette about something, and then you put them together in a way that tells a broader story. Well, when you play, and you mentioned it earlier, Jason, so it's something you said, I play this card, and I've now created the order of these cards is the narrative, just like it would be a Ken Burns, documentary, and you're just telling that version of the story. And so if you can live with the idea that there's this narrative arc being created by the cards, which I think is the best part of CDGs in the sense of what, the kind of the magic can sometimes happen and how events can all of a sudden become very appropriate. The downside of that also is some people just can't see a new story arc other than the one that happened historically, so therefore it's ahistorical. But I always come back to it's the paths not taken. In other words, I like to get in, when I do research on a game, I want to know, these are the 5 things they talked about. They did these 5 things, but there were 12 other options they never took, but they were discussed. Well, they need to be in the game, and that's where the CDG allows you to bring that part of the story in there, which is different than the original story.
And same, Jason, I was seeing you nodding, and I was wondering what you thought about that.
Well, I mean, flavor text has a lot of... My main problem with flavor text is I'm getting old and I can't read cards as it is. So if you put a lot of it on there, I can't read your damn card and figure out what the event that I need to play is. In general, I think it helps. And since I like my history obscure, it's almost necessary because most Americans' level of knowledge of history, particularly if it's something a little off the beaten path, is essentially 0. So a little clue, a little push in the right direction is I think welcome. Obviously, I've tended to put card descriptions in separate books just because I'm nerdy and I want to tell people about it, and if people want to read about it, it makes me happy. So, and then I don't have to cloud the card with a 1-sentence text. But I've tried it in both directions. And the other thing is you have to be so damn pithy to capture the focus of the card in a sentence or 2, and still leave room for everything else the card needs to do. So I think that's why I have mostly abandoned it as a practice and push things over.
Can I just say something to that point? I'm sorry. I saw that Game Board bloke, who I know from California, made a comment earlier on. Good guy. And when we did Versailles 1919, we had the flavor text on. We had all that stuff that's on the card and the flavor text. And when he played the game, he didn't quite yell at me, but it was close. I can't read the diagram. I can't understand what you want me to do. And so I took that to heart, and we took the flavor text off and we put it into the playbook. So if you want to read what the flavor text is, we actually wrote more. Go to the playbook. But by taking it off the cards, all of the graphics got 50% larger, and I can see them without glasses, so that they're definitely big enough. I mean, so I think that's going to your point, Jason. There is a real estate issue with how much text you can get on a card that's useful. That at the end of the day, you got to be able to play the game. So I try to make the flavor text like there's a title and there's a subtitle, and I hope that I can try to get in the subtitle enough that you can go look in the playbook or you can go look on Wikipedia or whatever, but that's how I've tried to handle that.
And I think we can, unless Volko, you had something to add on the flavor. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, well, I did a lecture for Georgetown University Wargame Society. You can find on YouTube about, considerations in using cards, how to design cards for conflict simulations. I talk about this, but it is precious real estate on that card, right? You're going to use half the card for a bunch of little text. You're really wasting. So what Mark and what Jason said, think if you're a chef, you're going to use salt, you're going to use spice, you're going to use fat, but don't use too much, right? How much you use, you need a little bit to do the job. So if your title already tells the player exactly why the mechanics are what they are, because it's very commonly understood, what, bad weather is, then maybe you don't need any flavor text. If it's something a little more obscure and you want to get a little bit of help to the player along with the title and the pictures to why, then use a one-liner if you need it and put the rest off in a reference book. make sure that the flavor text looks different, very different from the mechanical text, because that's a big danger with flavor text is players are going to read that as game text and then say in your rule book, this is what flavor text looks like on the card. It does not affect play. It's for your historical background.
I think that puts this topic to rest. Thank you, Volko. A lot of passion. I think that what I would like to do is, before we go into that last section of the discussion, I would like to do a small interlude. I asked each of you to think about what are your top 3 current CDGs. I only ask one rule from you. You cannot pick a game that you made, obviously, but I think that none of you would have done it, but just to be clear. And so the idea is to start from number 3, working our way up to number 1. It doesn't necessarily need to be a sequence of preference, but just your 3 pick there. It doesn't need to be hierarchy. I will just ask from you, because we're already pretty far in when it comes to time at 1 hour 25. So keep it to 1-2 minutes per game, and just present it and explain why it's in your current top 3, if that makes sense. Are you okay with it? We can start. So number 3, and I see Mark is ready. He's already reaching, like he's already there, already reaching for a game. I think we can start with you, Mark, if that's okay.
I really don't like this game very much.
Oh, wait a minute. The camera is on the yes.
Yeah, there we go. So,
Volko is blushing.
This game, and this will be clear, my top 3 of games I did not do. The difference between 1, 2, and 3 is really, I just wanted to, make Volko not feel too good about it, picking at number 1, and he would just be intolerable. But anyway, Wilderness War. I will say that I'm a big fan of. When I say I'm very interested in the French and Indian War, and the only reason why I never did a CDG on the French and Indian War is because this one's just too good. I wouldn't bother. So, thanks, Volko. I didn't have to do a game, and I appreciate that. It takes one off my list. And what's interesting is where I am. You can see in the background, I'm somewhere. Where I am, by the way, is about a quarter of a mile from something called Route 9. But long ago, it was called the Albany Post Road. And so that road that's just around the corner from my house is where the colonial troops marched going north to various campaigns in Canada during the French and Indian War. So the same road is called the Albany Post Road, same road. And, 1756 or so, 1757, American troops went up that road. So that's my number 3. But like I said, the distinctions, minor.
And you, Jason, you're number 3.
In light of what we discussed, I don't even know if it counts as a CDG, but I said
we broke your top 3.
But I said Sekigahara, just because I think the sad part about this is I remember running into that designer who apparently is quite a wealthy, brilliant man. And I remember him hawking his design at the same time I was trying to get Twilight Struggle published, and sitting next to tables begging playtesters to come sit down and try it. But in any event, I think it appeals to everything that presses my buttons. It's off the beaten path in terms of historical topics. It's very elegant, and it plays pretty fast. So I think it's quite good. It has a kind of an evergreen quality for me.
And just maybe to the whole discussion, I think it does, based on the discussion that the 3 of you had earlier in this discussion. For me, it still has some of the traits of the CDG, because you do have the choice of how you're going to use card, because you're going to discard them to decide how many moves you're going to be able to do or how many units you're going to be able to muster. So you do have the decision of, okay, I'm managing my hand. What do I keep? What do I drop? So in a way, you still have this. You have this point-to-point aspect to it, and there is also a political dimension, you could say, with the loyalty cards coming up. So maybe there is in small hints some of those elements there.
Well, thank you for coming to my rescue.
Yes, I will do anything to help you, Jason. Yeah, still a CDG. You're in the clear. It's all good. And you, Volko?
Yeah, and I followed your rules, I think. And I did pick, my current favorite CDGs. What would I play if you said, let's play a CDG, and I would be from these. But they also represent the kind of the phases of the evolution, the lineage that we talked about. So for traditional CDGs. Here's my favorite that we haven't talked about yet. Wellington by Mark McLaughlin, which has all the it has several of the innovations that were in the Napoleonic Wars. But what I love about Wellington, the reason I've played it so much, is it really zeroes in on the operational level, which is just of most interest to me. And so you get right into the action, the maneuver, the fighting. I'm always interested in what everybody else is doing. Every battle, no matter where it is on the peninsula, no matter what side I'm playing, I'm interested. The players, it's 4 players, 2v2, which has some really good ambiguous relationship, bad marriage kind of, between the 2 French players and the 2 Allied players. And everybody has a chance to play reaction cards on what other people are doing. So it's just a very high energy experience every time you play. It works beautifully.
Great. Back to you, Mark. What's your number 2?
Number 2.
Oh yeah, the other camera. Yeah, Crusade and Revolution. Yeah.
Right.
And this is the original version. I have at home at another location the big monster one, but I favor this one because it takes up a lot less table space than the other one. But this one is definitely a Paths of Glory clone. I mean, in fact, if you know how to play Paths of Glory, you'll be picking this one up pretty fast. But I haven't always been fascinated by the Spanish Civil War, and I think it just does a particularly good job at. I like the way the cards and the way it all kind of plays out. I just feel like it's a really good simulation of the war, and the cards really work in that particular context. So I really like, and he also uses early, mid, and late war is again it's a POG, so it has that same exact structure, and you can have the victory points work and all that. So I would say that would be my number 2.
And maybe a bit of foreshadowing. This summer, I'm actually having discussion with David, and he should come on the show to do a teach and play session of Crusade and Revolution. So soon, we'll talk about that game a bit more. Back to you, Jason. So what's your number 2?
Well, my number 2 is not a POG clone, but rather POG itself. I have very romantic notions about playing that game more and restarting it. But it was, to me, it illustrated so much that could be done with the CDG. I mean, it also illustrates that World War I is a fascinating game for conflict simulations, because up until then we'd had, sort of minor disasters in that arena, and now we have a bunch of fantastic World War I games. But Paths of Glory, I think, illustrated that even a war that we think of as being very, very conventional has a very important political dynamic, and CDGs emphasize that interrelationship in ways that make games better.
Nice. Volko, you were number 2? So
my number 2, and for me, a shining star in the sort of the first big evolution after the 1990s, the CDG form, is Combat Commander Pacific, which I think I've played at least as much as Europe, even though there's a smaller universe of scenarios for. But for me, Pacific, what's we've already talked about Combat Commander, but what's particularly endearing about and inspiring, actually, of the Pacific is that Chad and Kai Jensen, they didn't just say, okay, well, we have this big hit of Combat Commander Europe, and we're going to put it in Pacific and keep it the same. They looked at some things that didn't work as well, that were maybe weak points, and what was a brilliant design in Combat Commander Europe, and in other cases changed some things fundamentally to better fit the theater and the cultures. And for my money, you get an even more satisfying experience with Combat Commander Pacific than we do with Europe. It's so atmospheric and transporting, and it's just one that I will never stop playing.
Nice. That's yeah. Now I want to play Combat Commander. By the way, that's a perfect transition for me. You just reminded me of something. Next week, I'm playing Combat Commander live with Joe Dewhurst, who hates Exit counter games. He thinks they are boring and ugly. He never wants to play them, so I'm going to force him to play Combat Commander with him to change his mind, break his spirits, and make him come to the dark side.
And there aren't that many hexes.
No, not that many. Exactly. It's mostly around cards. That's what's important. Hexes are just casually there.
There's
it's
a few.
Not, yeah, there's a few, just a few. So yeah, just a bit of this. And now we're going back into the number one. So Mark, what's your number one?
Well, Volko already mentioned it, but
oh, that's super
and it's
nice.
a French game for darn sure. But anyway, I have to say that I like the fact that it's an area control game. I like the fact that it's got really it's got wooden pieces, so you don't not fussing around looking at numbers. And I got to tell you, as I said before, the card art is just a step above everything else I've seen anywhere. Obviously getting a famous illustrationist to do your card art was brilliant. Probably cost them a few dollars, but I'll tell you, fabulous game. Oh, Tardy, yeah, illustrated by Tardy. Yeah, you can see it on the board there.
And I'm not even sure that it was that expensive. Tardy is a pretty cool guy, so I think maybe he was happy to have his art featured.
I was expecting it, but let me put it this way: whatever he paid, it was well worth it.
It was worth it.
The look and feel of the game is just spectacular, and so those are and if you ask me a week from now, it might be some other mix of those, but I find it interesting that none of us picked each other's games.
You did pick Wilderness War, and we haven't done the number ones yet.
That's right.
Yes, yeah.
But I was just trying to make Volko feel better. He cries so much these days. It's so sad.
And you, Jason, what's your number one?
Well, to Mark's point, and kind of in a sadly sycophantic way, I chose We the People as my number one. It is still something that I can play with my son and get to the table, there's so much innovation in it that while it may have, it is not any longer the state of the art. It's still a fantastic gaming experience.
Oh, that's nice. Are you happy, Mark? You wanted it? Yes, that's what you wanted, right? Yes. Nice.
I wouldn't care. But thank you, Jason. It's very kind. I liked it too.
And you, Volko, what's your number one? I think there is maybe a crossover between your top three and someone else's top three. Yes. France wins. Yes.
So, and we've already talked about how it uses the CDG form to model trench warfare. I think there was a comment from Ricardo possibly about so many other aspects of just cool design to bring you into this amazing battle. One that I'll mention. Because as you know, the battle was very attritional. The whole German plan was to get the French to pile in bodies and to just kill more French than Germans were dying. I mean, just a weird plan. So it's up to the players how many reinforcements they bring in. It just costs you victory points, but you can pile in the bodies if you want to. And the dynamic of that between the two players alone is this, this interesting, mini game within the battle of trying to take territory. Anyway, it fits together beautifully. It plays smoothly. The use of the wooden blocks means that it looks really cool and is just clean and elegant. You don't have to do a lot of little factor counting or anything like that. But the exposition of the dynamics of that battle in this game are just unparalleled.
Great, but that closes the. Oh, I think that Jason, you wanted to say something?
Well, I've seen them both rave about this game now through this video, but I'd seen it on Twitter and I'd gone to buy it probably 5 times, but now you finally convinced me. I'm giving in to France.
And actually, there is something, and I would like to it's a second time he would have a shout out in this video, but I really would like to shout out to him. Board Game Bloke actually did the vassal mode for Verdun. He did an amazing job on it because it has some tricky parts, because there is you can actually select the cards that you bring in your hand. So, and he did an amazing job on it, making the game playable online in COVID times. That's really nice. So another reason to get the game, because you also have access to a great Vassal module to play with friends around the world. And Jason, if you want to have a teach and play of Verdun 1916 at some point, just come to the show and I will show you the game with great pleasure. But thanks for sharing that top three. Awesome selection. And now for a final part, and we're going to make it maybe significantly shorter, but more as a conclusion or actually an opening. I wanted to have that final part of the discussion that is around the future of CDGs. I know we touched a bit upon it when we were talking about the innovation of the past few years, but actually maybe my first question is about what innovations, mechanical innovations we expected and haven't seen, or things that you would like designers to start explore when they are making CDGs going forward. And maybe we can, I will let you, Volko thinks a lot right now. Mark also thinks a lot. So maybe I will start with you, Jason, while Volko and Mark are thinking about it. Sorry to put you on the spot.
I think one thing that might combine in a very interesting way, and there's some work being done on it in designs right now, is the interest in solo gaming and how you can use deck building and deck manipulation to represent a solo bot. And you know, I personally don't do a lot of solo gaming, but in that context, I would be very drawn to try it, just because, I don't know, it seems cool to me. Then functionally, the deck becomes an opponent's brain.
That sounds super hard to do, but it's super interesting. Now I need to think about it. You just hurt my mind, Jason. And you, Mark, any thoughts about expected mechanical innovation on how?
I mean, so the thing that I'm working on a game whose working title right now is called This is Sparta, and what I want to do is I want to represent the evolution of two royal houses across generations. And so I'm working on a way in which you're both playing cards for the moment, but you're also investing in the lineage of your house. And so that you're both playing in the near term and you're thinking about the future legacy. You're almost creating legacy for your own house as you go forward to keep Sparta going and to be the dominant Spartan royal house. So using cards in this sort of the here and now, like I play a card, I get an effect, but also having that card in some cases impact what's going to happen 3 turns from now is something I'm working on.
And you, Volko, any thoughts?
Yeah, I do. And I don't know if this is exactly what you're asking in terms of mechanical, but I guess what I would like to see is carrying the revolution forward in terms of settings and disciplines and topics. When I think back to the beginning, like what was so groundbreaking about We the People, and why is it that Hannibal, Rome versus Carthage changed my look of war games? It was before that, almost all historical simulation games that we played were very tightly focused on military affairs. And if there were events that brought in politics or something, they were kind of on the side, you know, they just sort of, you'd have, okay, it's the event phase, draw an event, and that would happen, right? And then Mark basically said, well, we're going to bring the politics right into the core of the game. And that was We the People. And now we're seeing that the reach of that goes far beyond the old core wargamer hobby. And so Twilight Struggle, which of course has some military stuff in it, but it's going very wide out into diplomatic and political grand strategic affairs. And the appeal of that is proven. So now people who might never have, you know, looked at something called a war game apparently love Twilight Struggle. And then we talked about Wir sind das Volk and other very non-traditional kinds of topics that this this genre can handle so well. So what else is possible? There's still a ton of history that is not military and not even political necessary, economic history, cultural history, social history, and so forth. The way that the PAC series has done as well, that I think CDGs would work very well for. So that's what I'd like to see. The trend is already there, but I'd like to see that continue to broaden and accelerate.
And that was actually the follow-up question that I had. So thanks for the transition, Volko, about the topics, because everything that we've discussed since the beginning of that show is the elasticity of the system and what it can represent. And that's also why I wanted to have Jason here, because the direction that you put CDGs in, like 1960 Making of a President, it feels definitely, it's a CDG, it feels like a war game, but it is definitely not a military conflict. And it showed that CDGs had that aspect to it, that you could cover other topics. And I was wondering what kind of topics you think CDG could explore in the future beyond what it has explored today. And I have a specific example in mind that resonates with what you just said, Volko. In one of my playtester for Red Flag Over Paris, she's called Kesia, and she was actually doing a small prototype for something around miner strikes in the US in the early 20th century, using CDG. And I was thinking, well, actually representing a strike and the political momentum that it has and the operational problems that you have, it's not technically a war, but it's definitely a social conflict. And it makes a lot of sense to actually think about those mechanics to represent the history of the working class or different kind of things. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts around this? And maybe starting with you, Jason.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the broader the better. I do think that the Zenobia Awards are exploring a lot of different topics. I don't know how many of those different topics will end up being CDGs, but since a number of them touch on civil rights issues or civil rights struggles in the United States and in some case globally, all of those conflicts are given to that kind of treatment because the narrative is told by the events, and you can kind of cast the two players in the roles of the competing sides without terrible, any real difficulty. Like I said, Al's work on doing the same thing with the trial is good. I don't see any reason why there can't be a CDG that's based on a literary piece. You have books where there are protagonists and they're trying to accomplish things, and there's a narrative arc that you need to work through. And I think a CDG would work perfectly well for that sort of thing.
And you, Mark, what do you think? Are there topics that you're thinking about? Because also with the Great Statesman series, you started using cards to actually represent internal political conflict, or even tension between allies. So the cards are actually not used to organize the warfare aspect of the conflict, but more the negotiation. Or there directions where you see that there is an opportunity to use that mechanic to explore new kind of topics?
Yeah, well, I have become, it always depends on what I'm interested in at the time. And I definitely have remained interested in internal, I have to say this quickly, but, we also look at a country like a rational actor. Now, in Imperial Struggle, the king really was the embodiment of the state, and you could, and I like the whole idea of how you invest. He's investing and hoping things are going to come out okay. That's like at that level. I think I like that a lot. But in you think about ancient Greece, and you think about even the United States today, faction drives a lot of good and bad decisions, and I think I'm really interested in how to continue to explore how people could be on the same team and yet not be on the same team. What I call, frenemies. I like that whole co-opetition. I find that those to be very interesting situations. I think the card-driven games work well in this kind of gray area where, sometimes I'm your friend and sometimes I'm trying to take you out. And I find that to be an interesting gaming experience broadly.
Yeah, and I think there is actually a game that does that in an interesting way, and that's the expansion for Versindas Volk 2+2. because normally you have East Germany versus West Germany, and actually this brings in the US and the USSR. And the thing is that, like, as East Germany, you need the support of the USSR to win, but then you want to remain keep a certain level of independence. And there is all this trade-off that is happening. And I think it's definitely one of the dimension of the.
Well, it's basically what the NVA and if there was a very different look in Fire in the Lake, was that we, for the first time, broke the communists into two separate factions, which I think you're finding out historically was more accurate than less as time goes on.
Good. We're getting really close to 2 hours, so I'm going to ask one last question just to conclude, and that's a question that I like to ask when we're talking about war games or specific family or things. Is what do you think are the limits of the system? If you're thinking about CDG, because we've been raving about it, everything that it covers and the different scales and the different topics, but what do you think, or maybe some core issues coming with the system that limits actually the how it can be used as a modeling tool? And maybe we can start with you, Volko.
Sure. I don't know if it's exactly a limitation, but it is a consideration, and one that might turn some players off depending on what you're looking for. And it was an aspect of CDGs that was mentioned in one of the comments, and that is what role are you in when you play an event? So if what we're looking for is modeling of history, that includes human agency, and it's role play to some degree. Like we're the king of France or whatever, we're somebody. Maybe that somebody is a collective. If we're using the CDG to bring in external events that in real life are far outside the control of that actor, like bad weather, let's say, or what some third power decides to do, and we're putting the decision of whether and when to deploy that event into the narrative in the hands of a player, there's a great gameplay, game design reason to do that, to make sure that that event pops up for the adversary at the most impactful time. But it gives you a little bit of a jarring dissonance with that role play. So that means either you're going to say, well, we're really going to be careful as the designer and make sure that every event is something that we can plausibly say, well, that whoever that player is representing could bring that event in, could somehow make that happen, right? Or we step away and say, no, that's not the approach here. The approach here, everything is an abstraction. Your role is an abstraction, and we're going to define your role more broadly as all kinds of things that might happen to your adversary, and just accept that and allow you to, create bad weather. But that's something I think that CDGs, that you're doing hand management, there are external events, and the reason they're events is probably because they are external to your specific role. You always bump into that potential simulation dissonance.
And you, Jason, what do you think?
I agree with everything Volko just said about how slippery player perspective can be in CDGs, particularly if you're working at a strategic level. You're the president, but the president in this country doesn't have these kinds of powers. It gets muddy. I guess I'm okay with that. But the other limitation that I think comes with CDGs is just the reality that reading slows games. And so it means that if you want to make a multiplayer CDG, you either have to say, to hell with it, I don't care that this takes 12 hours, or you have to combat that reading problem from the get-go. And either you do it, so you can use the sort of Euro market approach for cards that we see a little bit in Viz and Das Volk, or you can try and provide limited information, limited hand size. There are tricks to the trade for sure, but it does make designing multiplayer games on topics that deserve multiplayer treatment more difficult. Or you can just accept that this is only going to be accessible to wargamers who are willing to invest the kind of time necessary.
And you, Mark, any closing statements on the limits of CDGs?
Yeah, well, I think Volko said it very well, and I'll sort of say it a little bit differently in a sense that when the randomness of the card draw, I mean, you'll hear, it's you're drawing cards, right? There's randomness to that, and people not having enough player agency to still win the game, even if all the cards don't love you. But just like I've played games where the dice don't love you. So randomness is a natural, unless you're going to play chess, which has no randomness, you have to live with that. But I think that in a CDG, if it's not done well, the player feels like they have no agency, then there's a problem. So I think that's the weakness, is that when the players perceive they don't have agency, even though the cards are random. And I'll just pick up the note about Volko made about weather. Weather is probably one of the great functions that people, what am I, the thunder god? You hear all sorts of stupid phrases, but I will say that it is part of the simulation. So I'll give you a historical example. So we all know the famous story about the invasion of D-Day and the fact that the Allies had knowledge of the weather system way out in the Atlantic that was going to be a clear spot, and the Germans had they didn't have meteorological knowledge of that area. So they thought it was going to keep raining and no invasion. Only Eisenhower had the extra piece of information that said, oh, by the way, we're going to have a clear spot. So if you had a card that said, Allies, get clear weather when they, get clear weather, well, that was an intelligence advantage that the cards could represent. In Empire of the Sun, the same thing prevailed. The Japanese had weather stations on the Eurasian landmass and the Americans didn't. And so consequently, the Japanese knew, oh, look, there's a big storm forming up over Asia heading east. And Halsey walks into a typhoon. He didn't see it coming until it hit him because he had no warning. So sometimes players can't abstract the historical reality, and it just kind of so there's an example. Not so much that the history is bad, but the lack of player agency makes them feel bad. So I think that's the biggest weakness, is when they feel like they don't have agency over, even with the cards, they don't have agency over their fate in the game.
I never thought about the weather card this way. It's really awesome. So yeah, I have to think about that. But that's okay. But I think we're getting really close to 2 hours. It was awesome to have the three of you for so much time. So thanks again for taking the time. It was a awesome discussion. It could have lasted for a long time. It looks like, Volko, you have one last thing to say. No, you're good. No, I just wanted to thank the three of you. It was really great. Awesome. I don't know if you have any last statement before we end the stream, or no, everything has been said. Excellent. Perfect. Well, I want to thank you. The three of you, but also thanks everyone in the chat. We had some awesome questions and a lot of participation, so that was really, really great. So thanks to everyone. And also, usually before the streams, I ask on Discord and on Twitter if people have questions, and I always get awesome questions to ask to my guests. So I want to thank the community for participating so much. So that was really, really cool. Thanks again. Any of you are, of course, invited anytime you want. So Jason, happy to show you Verdun. Mark, if you want to do a teach and play of Empire of the Sun, so I can finally wrap my head around the game, that would be awesome.
And Volko, I'll teach Empire of the Sun whenever you want. You let me know.
Okay, I will definitely call you for that. And Volko will be an ongoing surprise guest for most of our videos during the whole summer. So expect to see him.
Pretty soon it'll be a surprise if I'm not here.
Exactly, that's the thing. People are like, when is Volko coming? That's super weird. But anyway, that was awesome. Thanks everyone, and have a good evening or afternoon if you're in the US. See you.
Thanks everyone.